My name is Dr. Katrina Kosec, and today I will be presenting the paper, Bringing Power to the People or the Well-Connected, Evidence from Ethiopia on the Gendered Effects of Decentralizing Service Delivery. And this is joint work with colleagues from IFPRI, Jisong, and Hongdi Zhao. So the research question we're examining here is, how does decentralizing service delivery affect women's and men's access to agricultural services, and through which mechanisms? And by decentralizing, we mean devolving authority for service deliveries from higher down to lower tiers of government. We examine this question in the context of rural Ethiopia, and in particular in 6 regions of Ethiopia, using household survey data that were collected from both husbands and wives in the same households. And we employ a technique called a spatial regression discontinuity design to try to show you that our impacts are causal. Now, to give you a preview of the results, we find that decentralization is often motivated by its potential to make service delivery more efficient and responsive to citizens' preferences. But we find that under decentralization, men, but not women, increase their interactions with now more powerful local government and civil society leaders. And the result is that there are efficiency gains from decentralization, sure, and these gains benefit both women and men, which is great, but men benefit relatively more. And the result is this growing gender gap in access to services. So it provides a cautionary tale about the potential for male capture and suggests that there may be some need to keep an eye on ways to ensure that women equally benefit and that gender gaps are not detrimental to women's empowerment. Now, our motivation here is a systematic review of empirical literature that reveals that there are over twice as many findings of positive compared to negative impacts of decentralization on service delivery. So we know this can really help move people out of poverty and improve service delivery. And the reason is that decentralization is fundamentally altering the accountability relationship that is incentivizing government service providers. And now you have providers closer to the ground, talking to the people that need services, figuring out what to provide, how, where, and when, and all those specificities that it's very efficient to have that superior local information in order to ensure that you're investing in the most optimal ways for a particular geography. Now, there's almost no research, however, on the distributional implications of decentralization. It brings decision-making power closer to the people, but which people? Now, we know that this matters, this question of who matters, because women and men have different policy priorities. They diverge over different goods, different issues. And even when they have similar priorities, which some studies show that they do, we have a situation in which women and men may compete to get access to services. There can be rivals, so only one gender fully benefits from the service. And women also can have mobility restrictions. They can have people that don't want to meet with them or provide services to them, and that can make them suffer in terms of accessing services. It's also increasingly recognized that sustainable agriculture is going to require attention to gendered power relations. And decentralization, as I hope to show you in this presentation, is yet another policy that many practitioners are promoting without fully understanding its gendered implications. So hopefully we can advance the work on this a bit. So how did decentralization play out in Ethiopia? Well, Ethiopia decentralized service delivery down to the district level in only 4 of its 9 regions during 2000 to 2001. And this decentralization implied that there was a transfer of block grants down to the district level as opposed to regional levels or higher levels, greater retention by districts of revenues that they generated internally. Districts could now appoint their own technical staff. They could make personnel decisions for district bureaucratic positions. And they also were given just a broader array of service provision responsibilities in agriculture, rural services, as well as primary health and education. Now, these groups of regions that were decentralized or not do differ on average. And in particular, decentralized regions were a bit less remote, they were more accessible via road networks, they had higher agricultural potential, and sometimes more favorable climatic and geographic conditions. But we're going to be using a statistical identification strategy that we hope will convince you that we've addressed these differences and these imbalances across regions so that we can really say what is the impact of decentralization itself and not the impact of the types of things that are correlated with decentralization. And I'll get into that in a minute. So what are the data? Well, we have a really detailed survey done called the Ethiopia Governance and Rural Services Survey. It was done during 2008 to 2009, and the survey interviewed both the head and spouse in each household separately wherever possible. So we end up with individual, household, and village level data for the survey. And we'll be using data on 1,440 individuals. There were 773 women and 667 men. They come from 838 households in 24 villages across 6 regions of Ethiopia. And the surveys capture supply of, access to, and satisfaction with agricultural services, as well as contacts with government officials and with civil society actors that are influential in those communities. We have 3 district pairs, and I'll show you those on a map in a moment, but each district pair straddles a region boundary. And region boundaries are important because those are the boundaries separating decentralized regions from non-decentralized regions. So we're always looking at these very geographically proximate districts that are hugging this boundary along which you have different regimens of service delivery on each side. We have other data that we use from the Demographic and Health Survey, which immediately conveniently preceded decentralization. So what we're going to try to show you is that households on either side of these boundaries, separating the decentralized and non-decentralized, those households looked really similar right before decentralization. And that's helpful because it makes them comparable in that they're affected mainly just by decentralization, and it's not that they already look qualitatively different. So this is the study area, and you'll see that the decentralized regions are blue, non-decentralized are yellow, and the hashed areas, that's where we have our district pairs. Now, zooming in on these, you can see 3 district pairs. One is in, we've got the Yaso and Ibantu are the districts here, and we're looking at the Oromia region here in the blue that was decentralized. And the Benishangul Gumuz region is the non-decentralized region here. Here we have Amara and Afar. Here we have a case of the SNNP region, and we have Gambela here. So what do we do? How do we tell you and convince you that when I compare households on these different borders that that these households are different only in decentralization? Well, we're going to follow a Melissa Dell's 2010 Econometrica paper. And this is a specification similar to that she estimates. And basically what we're going to capture here, Y is our measure of rural service delivery for individual I that lives in village K in region Q. D is just a dummy for local level decentralization. We've got a male dummy that's going to be interacted with it, so we can tell you what are the effects of decentralization on women and what are the effects on men separately. And then we're controlling for a lot of geographic characteristics. We're concluding a polynomial in latitude and longitude that allows differences between households to vary smoothly as we are moving through space in any direction. And then we have a vector of controls for individual characteristics. Our model is not particularly sensitive to whether or not these are included. So this shows that before decentralization, people on both sides of the border effectively look the same. They're just as likely to have a male head or a literate head or a head with secondary education. They have similar household sizes. We find that there's a little bit more likelihood of land ownership among the decentralized, but across a broad array of characteristics here, we find pretty much no more statistically significant effects than we would expect by random chance when we're running this many hypotheses. So you should really think of these households that we're comparing as very similar before decentralization sets in. And this is what happens afterward. On the left in red, you see what happens to women, and on the right in blue, you see what happens to men. And you see that the points of these estimates, these are coefficient plots here, they're mostly to the right of 0. That's telling you good things happened. We had more attendance of community meetings to discuss agricultural issues. We had participation in government programs, visits by DAs to the farm or home, visits to demonstration plots, etc. Especially use of modern agricultural inputs like access to fertilizer, pesticides, etc. We're seeing broad improvements. But what you'll see here is that the improvements for men are larger. And we also show in the paper that these are statistically significantly larger. And they will result in the growth in statistically significant increases in the gap between where women's access lies and where that of men lies. So this is a bit problematic. So we tried to delve into why this might be occurring. And the first place we looked at is the fact that under decentralization, you have hyper-local interactions that are suddenly more important because those local officials are having more control over what happens. And we find that men, interestingly, have much more engagement with local government officials following decentralization, and we don't see any statistically significant increase for women. Men are also more likely to be engaged with civil society actors. And for women, we find just short of statistical significance here in terms of their interactions with those officials. Voting is not hugely affected. There's very small impacts of increases in voting for women and not for men. But in an autocratic context like that of Ethiopia, voting in local elections doesn't really matter as much as these informal interactions for getting access to services. So we have a story here in which women and men are benefiting. Men seem to be benefiting more. And there seems to be something in it here that men's increased engagement with local government officials and civil society leaders that are influential may be explaining their differentially large improvements. So again, to conclude here, in this paper, we've tried to show you that decentralization is an important policy. It's becoming very common for people to speak, to practitioners in development to speak about decentralization as something on par with democracy for a way to improve the way government delivers services. It's often motivated by its efficiency and responsiveness to citizens' preferences. But we try to show you it's very important to keep our eye on whose preferences are being bolstered here and whose preferences maybe not as much so. So we have a win here. We have a policy that seems to do great things for agricultural service delivery, but at the same time, it does not appear to be benefiting women as much as men. So these efficiency gains and ways to make them work for women and not only men are a very big priority going forward. This is a cautionary tale about the potential for male capture when local level service delivery is carried out. And we think it's very important that complementary development programming, efforts to make women aware of the mandates of government and how they can access the services that government is providing, how we can stimulate that to ensure that these gaps don't grow, because there likely are ways to prevent any slide and any growth in the gap between genders. But the status quo seems to suggest that this is not occurring, and there may be a need for more creative policy solutions for that to happen. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any comments that you might share.